Alright, y'all, this is Appalachian Ghost Stories, episode 4, The Horse with a Halo. Many years ago on Leatherwood Creek in Clay County, there appeared a large white horse with a halo. Although the members of the family who saw it described the event in different ways, there was general agreement that a glowing halo of soft light was seen above the horse wherever it went. One evening after supper, the family had gathered on the front porch of their house and were engaged in the lively pleasure of genial conversation. Then abruptly, all talking stopped and everyone looked toward the highway. At some 400 yards distance, they saw a white horse coming up the highway. It walked with a spirited gait. Its long white mane flowed back in the gentle breeze, and above it floated a halo. When the family saw the horse turn off from the highway and start up the lane toward their house, they all ran inside and locked the door. From the windows, they watched to see what the horse would do. With liveliness, it came prancing up the lane alongside the whitewashed board fence. On arriving at the yard gate, it stopped momentarily. Then, with a toss of its head and a loud snort, it reared up and leaped over the gate into the yard and came on toward the house. By this time, the members of the family were quite excited. Some were running from one window to another to get a better view of the horse, while others were looking for places to hide. Then the horse leaped with a loud clatter onto the front porch. It now appeared to be monstrously large, its eyes shining like coals of fire, and above it was the halo. When the horse began to stomp the front door down, the family escaped by way of the back door and ran some distance up the hill back of the house. There, they hid behind some trees and waited to see what it would do. In a short time, they saw the horse back out of the house into the front yard and start to float upward in the air. Up and up it went until it passed out of sight. But the halo remained against the sky a long while after the horse had disappeared. No one has ever been able to find a rational explanation of this strange event. That's story 1, you guys. All right, y'all, this is story 2. A gift for Angela. At the time of the oil and gas boom in the Blue Creek section of Kanawha County, a flood of newcomers moved into the area. Among those who came were Clyde and Asbury Carpenter, who were employed as roustabouts in the oil field. Soon after their arrival, the brothers became acquainted with Angela Carter, an attractive young woman of Falling Rock, whose affections they sought with considerable rivalry. Although Angela was disturbed at times over the heated arguments they had over her, she was secretly pleased about it and tried to be equally friendly with both of them. In time, however, Angela fell in love with Asbury. They announced their engagement and begun to make plans for a June wedding. Then the coming of World War I interrupted their plans. Both Asbury and Clyde were called by the Selective Service Board to report for physical examinations preliminary to induction. A few days after their examinations, the brothers were notified that Clyde had failed to qualify, but Asbury was accepted and had 1 month to prepare for induction. Asbury and Angela hurriedly rearranged their wedding plans so they could be married before his departure. After they were married, they lived with Angela's parents until the time for Asbury to report to the induction center. It appeared that Clyde had accepted Angela's choice without any bitter feelings. On the day of Asbury's departure, Clyde accompanied his brother and Angela to the depot to see him off and to wish him well. As Asbury entered the train, Clyde called out to him, "Don't you worry about Angel Face, Asbury. I'll take good care of her for you while you're gone." For 2 or 3 months after Asbury left, Angela received letters from him quite often. However, on his transfer to Europe, he wrote less frequently and in time stopped altogether. In the meantime, Clyde and Angela developed a closer relationship. One evening, when Clyde went to see Angela, he told her that he had heard some people down at Elkview talking about a big battle occurring in France, that Asbury's battalion was involved and had been totally wiped out. When Angela questioned the failure of the War Department to notify her about it, if it were true, Clyde explained that in a case such as this, it could be months before all the necessary notifications were officially delivered. Angela did not fail to observe Clyde's kindness in breaking the sad news to her, and as a concerned brother-in-law, his generous offer to be available for any needs she might have. From this moment, a deeper affection grew between them, and in time, Clyde talked her into marrying him. Oh my God. On Christmas Eve, while Clyde was decorating the tree in the living room of their home, and Angela was in the kitchen, she heard the front door open. Then she heard Clyde say, "Well, well, if it isn't Asbury." Out of sight in the kitchen, Angela stood as if petrified. Next came Clyde's pleading voice. "No, no, Asbury. Please don't shoot." Then there was a sharp pistol shot. Angela quickly regained control of herself. On rushing into the living room, she got a glimpse of a man in a soldier's uniform going out the front door and closing it behind him. On the floor lay Clyde with a bullet hole in his forehead. Before Angela had time to recover from this initial shock, there was a light knock on the door. With a trembling hand, she opened it, and there stood a boy with a letter in his hand. "A telegram for Miss Angela Carpenter, ma'am," the boy said. Angela quickly opened the envelope, and with eyes brimming with tears began to read. "We regret to inform you that your husband, Asbury Carpenter, was killed in action on December 21st, 1917. That's story number 2, y'all. All right, y'all, this is story number 3. Spooks and Fairy Diddles. Glen Burnie Lodge was the name given to the mountain retreat that Glen and Bernice Stafford personally built in their leisure time. It was situated in a secluded spot, yet was easily accessible and only a few miles distant from their home in Elkins. Here in their serene sylvan second home, they spent many happy weekends and vacations together. In the 1930s, Glen and Bernice moved to Cleveland, where he was employed in a munitions plant, and thereafter, it was only on rare occasions they found the opportunity to return for brief visits to Glen Burnie Lodge. During their absence, however, Bud Slagle, a young man of their acquaintance while residing in Elkins, looked after the lodge for them. Although somewhat handicapped by having a club foot, Bud was industrious and thoroughly dependable. True, he never answered Glen's letters or of instructions about caring for the property, yet he always did what he was asked to do. Early one spring, Glen had informed Bud he wanted certain repairs made at the lodge in preparation for a short vacation he and Bernice planned to spend there in early autumn of that year. Because of the noise and congestion of urban living, they longed to escape to the solitude of the mountains and hopefully, once again, experience the gentle pleasure of tranquil living. On arriving at Glen Burnie Lodge, in the early afternoon of a calm September day, they were surprised to find that Bud had not completed the work he had been asked to do. In fact, it appeared he had only just begun. After unloading the car, Glen decided to drive down to Elkins and try to locate Bud, leaving Bernice to unpack and store away their supplies. Sometime later in the afternoon, while Bernice was in the bedroom, she distinctly heard someone walking through the hallway outside her bedroom door. She recognized at once the scuffing sound of Bud's club foot as it scraped the hardwood floor. She surmised that Glenn had found Bud and had brought him back to help make the repairs needed at the lodge. However, on opening the door and looking out, she saw no one. She then went outside and looked all about the lodge. The only living thing she noticed was a fairy diddle, which scampered out from behind a tree and disappeared around a back corner of the lodge. Glenn returned shortly thereafter with the information that Bud had gone to Cumberland to visit a sister back in April, and no one remembered having seen him since. It appeared that if any repairs were to be made, Glenn would have to make them himself. A thought that left him in a not too happy frame of mind. Therefore, it was with some reluctance that Bernice told him about the noise she had heard in the hallway. As she expected, he began to tease her about her unbridled imagination. Shortly after dark, that same evening, when Bernice went out on the front porch, she noticed some lights in the woods far down below the lodge. They appeared to be the headlights of a car moving slowly up the valley. She listened for the sound of a motor, but could hear none. When she informed Glenn about it, he came outside and joined her. After watching the lights for a few moments, he said in a hushed voice, "Why, that can't be a car, Bernice. There's no road down there." As they watched, they saw the lights rise above the treetops and move slowly toward them. At a point some 300 or 400 yards distant, the lights stopped momentarily, then moved back into the valley. For a half hour or so, the lights continued to move back and forth, and each time seemed to come a little closer to the lodge. Throughout the whole time, Glenn and Bernice were fascinated by this phenomenon. However, when they saw the lights come up and disappear behind the lodge, they became somewhat alarmed. Glenn hurriedly got a flashlight, and they both went out to investigate. Only a short distance behind the lodge, they saw a dull light glowing from the trunk of a fallen tree. "It's only foxfire," Glenn exclaimed as he touched the glowing wood with his hand. "I don't know, but it's my guess those lights we saw must have been some sort of phosphorescent gas floating through the air." As they were returning to the lodge, a fairy diddle cut across their path almost underfoot and rustled the leaves as it fled into the darkness. Bernice was startled by its sudden appearance, and Glenn admitted he could not remember ever having seen one out at night before. Soon after they'd gone to bed that night, they heard someone walking through the hallway. It was the same scuffling sound Bernice had heard there in the afternoon. Suddenly, both sat bolt upright. The footsteps had stopped just outside their bedroom door. Glenn felt for the handgun and flashlight on the nightstand, then quietly got out of bed and moved toward the door. The footsteps were then heard again as they moved out the hall toward the living room. Quickly opening the door, Glenn flashed the light out into the hall, but he could see no one. At that moment, Bernice gave a blood-curdling scream. Glenn rushed back to her, only to find that a fairy diddle had run across the bed and in its fright had leaped upon her head. Bernice was thoroughly unnerved and sat on the side of the bed sobbing softly. Although Glenn was a little shaken himself, he sat down beside his wife and put his arm about her shoulders. His efforts to console her eased her fright after some time. Nevertheless, she felt there was something sinister in the appearances of the fairy diddles. Glenn lit the bedroom lamp, then taking Bernice by the hand, he led her from room to room and lit the lamps throughout the house. He also checked the front and back doors and the windows, and as well as he could detect, found there had been no tampering with them. Still, neither had any desire to sleep. So Glenn built a wood fire in the fireplace, and they sat up the remainder of the night. By the time daylight came, they had decided to return to Cleveland. They prepared and ate a light breakfast, then began to pack their luggage and load the car. Just as they were all about ready to leave, Bernice remembered that she had promised one of their neighbors in Cleveland to get some wild fern fronds for her on this trip. While Glenn made a last-minute check about the premises, Bernice went into the woods back of the lodge to get the ferns. Shortly thereafter, Glenn heard his wife scream. Thinking that she might have seen another fairy diddle, he started out around the house at a leisurely stride. However, when he saw her, he broke into a run toward her. She was standing over knee-deep in a leaf-filled depression and screaming at the top of her voice. As he ran toward her, he noticed she was not looking toward him, but was staring at something beside her. Extending upward through the leaves at her side was a man's leg. Glenn lifted his wife out of the leaves, then both ran to the car and immediately drove to Elkins to notify the authorities. Later, when they returned with the sheriff, the coroner, and others, and the body was removed from the leaf-filled pit. It was found to be that of Bud Slagley. It appeared he had been clubbed to death. The murder of Bud Slagle has remained a mystery. Yet, there were some people in the community who were intrigued by this event because of what had occurred only a few miles from there about the same time. A housewife, while at the barn milking the cows early one morning, was attacked and then bludgeoned to death. Her attacker was later found to be an inmate of the medium security prison at nearby Huttonsville, who, after murdering the woman, had returned to the prison and gone back to bed. In his subsequent trial, he was found guilty of murder and was executed at the state penitentiary. Although there was no evidence of any connection between these two crimes, it was suspected by some people they were both committed by the same person. Glenn and Bernice returned to Cleveland and never again visited at Glen Burnie Lodge. Sometime thereafter, the lodge was sold to a group of sportsmen, but before they had an opportunity to use it, some intruders, through their carelessness, burned it down. That's story number 3, you guys. This is story number 4, y'all. The Judgment Brought. At Low Gap Run in the eastern section of Gilmer County was the farm home of the family of Benjamin Johnson. In the spring of 1858, the time of the incident related here, the family consisted of Ben, his wife Susan, and a 5-year-old son, Richard. At the time, Susan was pregnant with a child who, at birth, would be named Mary and destined never to know her father. Although regarded as a fairly successful farmer, with the status of slaveholder, Ben Johnson, at 37, was not a happy man, easily provoked to anger and with little compassion for others. He was a man to be feared, especially by his slave William. However, moreover, the independent spirit of William only aggravated Ben's evil nature. Sometimes, when William crossed his master, he was tied to a post and lashed with a black snake whip across his bare back until the blood ran down and soaked the waistband of his trousers. As additional punishment, Ben, on some occasions, rubbed salt into the cuts and wounds on William's mutilated back. Oh, man. Because of the nature of slaveholding in West Virginia at that time, people were somewhat suspicious of the desirability of slaves who were offered for sale. So both times that William was sold to other farmers, the condition of sale was that he could be returned if he proved to be unsatisfactory. And both times he was brought back to the Johnson homestead, a living hell for him. Early one morning in June, Ben took Ben took William with him to cut weeds in the tobacco patch above the house. Soon after they arrived there and had begun their labor, William suddenly attacked Ben by hitting him several times on the head with his hoe and killing him almost instantly. William then placed Ben's body in a ravine and covered it with leaves and limbs he broke from trees nearby. Now that he had freed himself from his evil master, William was in a quandary as to what he should do next. After recalling that there was a large wheat field nearby, he cautiously made his way there and hid. When night came, he crept out of his hiding place and went to the Johnson cellar for milk. At first, he was careful not to drink very much milk from each crock, so it would not be missed by Miss Johnson and others at the homestead. However, by the third night, he was so famished that he drank most of the contents of one crock before stopping. The next day, High Sheriff E.T. Stout was informed of the disappearing milk. When night came, the sheriff and his deputies were hiding about the cellar, and as expected, William came back for more milk. He was promptly captured and placed in the county jail in Glenville. Although the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled in the Dred Scott case only the year before that slaves were property and therefore not entitled to a court trial. Nevertheless, the county court of Gilmer County decided to grant William a fair trial by that body. The trial began during the July term in 1858 with Philip Cox as the presiding justice and William Lynch, Robert Kirkpatrick, James Cather, and Moses W. Farnsworth as gentlemen justices. Gilmer County court records show the following: Commonwealth versus William, a slave, felony. The property of Benjamin Johnson, deceased, of Gilmer County, who stands charged with a felony by him committed in the county of Gilmer and within the jurisdiction of this court. In this, that he did on the 4th day of June, 1858, willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly kill Benjamin Johnson, was this day set, and the attorney for the Commonwealth, as well as William E. Lively, who was by the court appointed counsel for the prisoner, being present at the bar in the custody of the sheriff of this county, and the said slave being thereupon arraigned, pleaded not guilty. And the court, having partly heard the evidence and not having time to conclude the same was adjourned until the next morning at 8 o'clock, until which time the case is continued and said slave is remanded to jail. The court opened next morning, July 21st, and Levi Johnson was appointed by the court to write down the testimony in the case. Court then adjourned until the following morning. Next day, all the evidence was heard, but the court not having time to hear the argument, it adjourned until the next morning at 8 o'clock. The court convened next morning, and it was ordered by the court that the slave, William, be hanged by the neck until dead. It was further ordered that the sentence upon him be executed publicly on Friday, the 1st day of October, between the hours of 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, on a lot belonging to W.S. Fell in the hollow above the M.E. Church, until the time the slave was remanded to jail. The court proceeded to value the slave as the law directed. Each justice present in the court affixed to him such value as in his opinion the slave would bring it if sold publicly under a knowledge of the circumstance of his guilt. Whereupon Philip Cox valued him at $775, William Lynch at $500, and Robert Kirkpatrick at $600, and Moses W. Farnsworth at $700, upon which the legal value was ascertained to be $635. Robert Lynn was at the time prosecuting attorney, William E. Lively, the slaves' counsel, was by an order of the court allowed $25 to be paid out of the estate of Benjamin Johnson. When daylight came on that first day of October in 1858, people could be seen coming into Glenville from all directions, some on horseback, some in wagons and buggies, and many on foot. Most of them brought their lunches with them and came prepared to spend the entire day in the village. The scaffold for the execution had been erected in the lower part of the ravine above the M.E. Church and directly behind the present location of Pickens Hall of Glenville State College. As the people arrived in town, they immediately congregated in the area round about the scaffold until every available foot of ground within sight of the scaffold was occupied. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, William, the convicted slave, was removed from the jail back of the courthouse and hurriedly brought across the scaffold. With his hands tied behind him, he was helped up the stairway onto the platform, where he almost immediately, in a loud yet calm voice, delivered a long and moving prayer. Then, in a clear, tremulous voice, he sang the song that he seemed to comfort him during his long hours in prison. Must I be to judgment brought to answer in that day? At the conclusion of his song, the noose was adjusted around his neck, and a black hood put over his head. Shortly thereafter, Sheriff E.T. Stout sprang the trap, and William plunged through the opening in the platform. His body jerked spasmodically a few times and then hung lifeless. The reaction of the crowd to William's performance and his ensuing execution was mixed. While some staring in stony silence throughout the proceedings, others openly and unashamedly wept. There were many who believed that the crime committed by William, though an abhorrent one, was justifiable in his situation. Following the hanging, the sheriff took charge of the body and had it removed to the county poor farm for burial. His grave is said to be located near the seventh putting green on the Glenville Golf Course. That's story number 4, y'all. All right, y'all, this is story number 5. A China Doll. The decade of the 1880s marked a turning point in the history of southern West Virginia. Prior to that time, practically all of the people residing in that area were of Anglo-Saxon or Scotch-Irish lineage, whose ancestors had migrated into this region in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They were an independent and stalwart people who were often poor in worldly goods, yet were generally content with their lot and proud of their heritage. Then came Frederick Kimball's act of imagination that changed the course of the history of that area. The extension of the Norfolk and Western Railroad into this fabulously rich Pocahontas coalfield, an immediate result was the influx of new people whose way of life often clashed with that of the native stock. Generally, the newcomers were looked upon by the native people as inferior interlopers. Moreover, the superstitious hill people considered the subterranean occupation of coal mining to be unlucky as well as demeaning, and only a little less than peonage. Farming, timbering, and even whiskey making, then claimed by some of the natives as a constitutionally guaranteed right, were regarded as being superior to coal digging and loading. Among the newcomers was Tony Borrow, whose tall, hulking frame and pockmarked face from an earlier bout with smallpox gave him a sinister appearance. After a short stint as a miner, he, through some maneuvering the native people never understood, became the chief of police in Aracoma. After only a brief tenure in his new position, he had shot 2 men, allegedly in self-defense, was regarded as trigger-happy and basically a coward. For some of the out-of-town native people, the good old days of coming to town on Saturdays for a time of greeting and drinking, and sometimes wrangling with old friends, were not the same, thanks to the ubiquitous Boro. About 2 miles back on a mountain from Aracoma lived Big Red Naylor with his wife, Sarah, and children Tom and Selma. He had a small farm on which he raised fruits, especially peaches, corn, and a few vegetables. As a quiet sideline, he made peach brandy and corn liquor, for which he found a ready market, along with his produce. In Aracoma. In the summer and fall of the year, Big Red would often be seen driving his decrepit one-horse wagon about town making deliveries. When sober, Big Red was a jovial man, kind and gentle to his wife and children. But when he became drunk, he was cruel, downright mean, and unpredictable. His son Tom, at the age of 11, seemed to know how to avoid any confrontation with his father. However, little Selma, 7 years old, was often the object of his anger when he was drunk and quaked with fear of her father. On his becoming sober, he would apologize for his actions, and little Selma would laugh nervously, a laugh that was coarse and hollow and devoid of mirth. One warm summer day, after Big Red had made his deliveries in Aracoma, he was in a jovial mood as he and his son Tom were leaving town. While crossing the Guyandotte River Bridge and singing in a loud and boisterous manner, he was stopped by Boro, who gave him a tongue lashing for disturbing the peace. When Big Red talked back, Boro hopped up in the wagon and pistol whipped him until he was unconscious. Boro then told Tom to tell his father when he revived not to come back to town again. On his regaining consciousness, Big Red seethed with anger and began to drink heavily. By the time they reached home, he was in a very nasty mood. When Selma saw her drunken father coming, she huddled behind a chair on the front porch with her china doll cuddled in her arms. Big Red staggered onto the porch, knocked the chair aside, snatched the doll from Selma, and hurled it to the floor. He then stormed into the house while his daughter remained there in stunned silence. At her feet lay her broken china doll. The next day, Big Red was sober and penitent. "I'm sorry I broke your doll, Selma," he said to her. "That's all right, Daddy," Selma replied, then began to laugh nervously. When Big Red put his hand gently on Selma's head and drew her closer to him, her laughing turned to crying, then burying her face against his shoulder. She sobbed as if her heart would break. Now, babe," he said in a husky voice. "I don't suppose they've stopped making china dolls." A few days later, Big Red, in defiance of the order of the chief Boro to stay out of town, strode boldly into Aracoma. He was sober, alert, and outwardly calm. Inside, he seethed with anger. Later in the day, as he emerged from a store, he saw Boro standing in the street and looking directly at him. As Big Red moved his right hand toward his coat pocket, Boro drew his gun and shot him. Big Red came tumbling down the steps of the store building and rolled into the street where he lay still. As the people crowded round, Burroughs said, "You saw him reach for his gun, didn't you?" "I had to shoot him." A friend of Big Red leaned over him and lifted his hand from his pocket. It was not a gun. He clasped his hand, but on a China doll. The hatred of the people toward Burroughs became so intense, he left Aracoma immediately and was never seen there again. In the meantime, Big Red's wife was notified of his death. When Sarah and her children came to town to remove the body, they scorned the proffered help of bystanders and managed to get Big Red in the wagon by themselves. Before leaving town, Sarah purchased some black cloth and pine boards with which to make a coffin and placed them in the wagon beside the body. As they rode along toward home, Tom drove while Selma sat dry-eyed and calm beside her mother. "Your daddy did love you, Selma," Sarah said gently. "Just getting another doll for you, the way he did, took a lot of courage. He really did love you." Selma looked straight ahead and did not reply. Late on the night of the wake, when all the guests were in the kitchen, Selma brought her broken doll to the coffin. After giving it a gentle hug and a kiss, she placed it in the coffin beside her father's body. As noiselessly as she had come, she crept back to her bed and quietly cried herself to sleep. All right, y'all, this is story number 6, Invasion of the Green Monsters. Late in the evening of September 13th, 1952, a number of unidentified spacecraft passed over the eastern area of the United States. They were moving in a northwestward direction and were observed by people in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, as well as in West Virginia. While passing over the Allegheny Plateau, at least 3 of the spacecraft became separated from the others, 2 of which apparently met with disaster in the hills of Clay and Braxton counties of West Virginia. Whether these were remote-controlled destructions or accidental ones, no one here will ever know. However, a review of the evidence as reported by those who witnessed the strange happenings indicates that both causes may have been involved. In Clay County, a number of witnesses reported having observed a strange luminous ball passing low overhead in the twilight of the evening. On its drifting to a lower elevation, it ended in a dazzling flash of light on a wooden hillside. Those who investigated the scene soon afterward reported that the spacecraft, while on the way to obliteration against the hill, had seared a swath of forest foliage, crisp and brown, and filled the air thereabouts with a lingering, acrid odor. The incident, which received the most widespread publicity, was the appearance of the so-called Braxton County Green Monster. Miss Kathleen May of Flatwoods, a few days after the occurrence, reported to a nationwide television audience that she joined a group of young people to investigate the claim of her 2 sons that they had seen a flying saucer land on the hillside overlooking the small town. On climbing the hill, they came upon a monster 10 feet tall with a bright green body and a blood-red face, which moved toward them with a sliding, floating motion. A noxious odor filled the area, which brought on violent choking spasms and vomiting by some members of the search party as they fled from the scene. Subsequently, investigators reported smelling the sickening odor as well as observing burnt and broken branches of the trees where the flying object had landed, but the monster and its spacecraft had disappeared. An incident which received little publicity at the time, was that observed on the same evening by George Snitowski and his wife Edith of Queens, New York, while they were traveling by car between Frametown and Gasaway, a few miles to the east of Flatwoods. Without any forewarning, the motor of their car stopped and a quick check indicated that the practically new battery was dead. They said that suddenly a faintly sickening odor, somewhat like a mixture of burnt sulfur and ether, filled the air about them and caused their baby to have an attack of coughing and gagging. While Edith attempted to console the child, George went out to try to locate the source of the odor. Crossing over a slight rise to the left of the highway, he saw some 60 yards down the slope a large spheroid moving slowly back and forth as it hovered near the ground, and from it came a soft violet light. On moving closer to the object, he felt the sensation of thousands of needle-like vibrations irritating the skin of his whole body. Nauseated, he turned and stumbled back toward the car. From the car, Edith gave a piercing scream. George could see her ashen face, her trembling lips, and her eyes wide and staring. "Edith, for God's sake, what's the matter?" George shouted. "Hurry, George, hurry!" she cried in terror. "It's coming behind you." George glanced back over his shoulder and saw, some 30 feet behind him, a figure about 8 or 9 feet tall, with a big head, bloated body, and long, spindly arms gliding rapidly toward him. On entering the car, he hurriedly ran up the windows, locked the doors, then dived to the floor under the steering column. Meanwhile, Edith had crouched with the baby to the floor in the back seat of the car, where she tried to relieve her child of its gagging and crying by placing a silk handkerchief over its face. Then, terror-stricken, they waited to see what the monster would do. After some time, George rose up slowly and saw a long, spindly arm, forked into 2 soft ends, reach across the windshield and touch the hood of the car. After another agonizing wait, he looked again and saw the monster glide across the road and up and over the slope in the direction of its spacecraft. With a feeling of slight relief, they watched and waited. Then, George related later, my eye caught sight of the ascending iridescent globe over the trees. It rose slowly and made intermittent stops, hanging in midair for a split second before continuing upward. And then, at about 3,000 feet, I guess, it swung back and forth like a pendulum gathering momentum. Suddenly, it swooped up in an elliptical arc and with a dazzling trail of light, shot completely out of sight. A half hour later, the Snitowskis, pale-faced and still thoroughly shaken from the ordeal, stopped at a motel in Sutton for the night, without telling anyone at the time about their terrifying experience. Because of the unusual skepticism held by the public toward such phenomena and the accompanying ridicule for those reporting having seen them, they believed it wise for the time to remain silent. The next morning, while getting gas at a nearby service station before resuming their trip, the attendant pointed out to Snitowski a V-shaped brown spot on the hood of his car that appeared to have been burned into the paint. Having heard of the Flatwood scare of the evening before, the attendant said in mock seriousness, "It looks as if the green monster was after you too." Looking the attendant directly in the eye, George replied, "I wish you could have seen it." As the family drove away, the attendant said to his helper, "By golly," he said that as if he really meant it. All right, y'all, this here is story number 7, Heady Revenge. At the time of the beginning of the Civil War, John Jennings lived with his wife and their 2 small sons, Frank and Jack, on a farm in Wetzel County. Only a few years prior to this, he had bought the farm, which was located between Doolin and Fishing Creeks, about 3 miles from New Martinsville. Most of the people in that area at the time were strongly for the Union, and some military units were being formed of volunteers thereabouts. In a spontaneous act of patriotism, John Jennings joined a company of volunteers which soon thereafter was accepted into the Union Army. After being away from home a few months, John became so homesick to see his wife and children he could think of little else day or night. His worry about his family and loss of sleep began to sap his strength and affect the performance of his duties. If he could only be with his family a short time, he thought, he could settle down and do a much better job of soldiering. When he approached his commanding officer with a request for a brief leave to visit his family, he was perfunctorily dismissed. The time came when he could stand it no longer, so he deserted his company and returned home. Word was soon spread about the community that John Jennings was back home with his family, and immediately some members of the Home Guards went out to investigate. When John saw them coming, he suddenly had visions of being court-martialed and possibly executed for desertion from the army. He at once started running towards the woods back of the house. The Home Guards followed him in close pursuit, but he escaped. Over the next several months, John lived much of the time in caves in the woods, with occasional brief visits to his home. It usually occurred that whenever he did come back to his house, the guards heard about it, and in their efforts to capture him, they scared him away again. A number of times his wife had to take supplies to him in the woods because it was thought to be unsafe for him to venture out of hiding. As a result of one such trip on a bitter cold winter night, she suffered so much from exposure she was stricken with pneumonia fever and died. When John heard that President Lincoln had issued an offer of pardon to all deserters who immediately returned to their military posts, he first made arrangements for his sons to be taken care of. Then he rejoined his military unit. On his arrival back in camp, his former buddies completely ignored him. He was shunned as if he were a leper. He had to mess and pitch his tent apart from them from the time of his re-entry into the service until the war ended. When the men of John's company were discharged and put aboard a ship to be returned, he was forcibly put off the ship by his former buddies and had to find a way home on his own. His arrival home, as he expected, was not a happy event for him. His children were glad to see him, but most of his neighbors and former friends treated him as if he were an outlaw. After some time, John remarried and tried to establish a normal life in the community with his second wife and Frank and Jack, the sons of his first marriage. Although he enjoyed a congenial home life, elsewhere he was not permitted to forget his past. While his sons were growing to manhood, they became extremely embittered over the treatment that their father received. By the time they were late teenagers, they had decided to seek revenge on all those who had persecuted his father in any way, even though he begged them to ignore what had happened. Soon after, Frank and Jack began to rob and steal from some of their father's persecutors. They were joined in their activities by a number of ex-convicts, fugitives from justice, and young delinquents. The gang's activities were extended to highway robbery, raping, and attempted murder, and brought on a reign of terror in the hills of Wetzel County. The residents of the area lived in a constant state of anxiety and fear. People who had formerly left their doors and windows open on hot summer nights now closed and locked them out of fear of the Jennings gang. There were many rumors circulated about evil doings of the gang which never occurred yet. Yet these added to the disrepute that tarnished the former good name of the county. The real and imagined doings of the gang seemed to defy all efforts of the local authorities to restrain. It reached a point where it could no longer be tolerated, so the people decided to take action. In 1873, several men organized an extra-legal, clandestine group known as the Red Men. They wore uniforms with pillowcase-style head coverings made of red cloth. Usually, in quiet, orderly movement, they visited the homes of those persons who had befriended members of the Jennings gang, ordered the families to leave the county, and then promptly burned their houses down. Within a short time, a number of blackened homes sites dotted the countryside. About 2 o'clock one night, the Red Men appeared at the home of John Jennings. He must have been expecting them to come because even though the night was unusually warm, they found him in bed fully dressed. The Red Men were not there to punish him because they knew he had opposed his son's illegal activities. But he had come to get information on his son's whereabouts. When he informed them he had no idea where they were, the men asked him to go with them. He was being held, they informed him, until his son was found. When John refused to go along with the Red Men, they tried to put a rope around him, but he struggled free. Meanwhile, John's wife, thinking the men were going to kill her husband, ran to the wood yard for an axe and brought it to him. The men then opened fire, killing John immediately and slightly wounding his wife. As soon as Frank and Jack Jennings learned of their father's death, they fled from the county and were never seen there again. However, some people claimed that the spirits of these men were known to roam the hills of Wetzel County for several years thereafter. Fox hunters out on moonlit nights often reported seeing fleeting specters in silhouette as they moved along the crests of Flinderation and Doolin ridges. Those who saw the ghostly shadows speculated that the evil deeds perpetrated by the Jennings brothers were so wicked that the souls of these men were not permitted any rest until some retribution had been made. All right, y'all, this is story number 8, Twins in the Whirlpool. On the south bank of the Little Kanawha River, near its mouth, was a tavern known as The Rest. Near its front entrance, there was a swinging sign on which were the words, "Entertainment for man and beast." From the time of its being licensed to serve the public as a tavern in 1789 until it went out of business in 1850, it served as a temporary stopping place for countless numbers of restless pioneers on the march westward. The local settlers of the area also met there and related tales of Indian fighting, of struggles they had with bears and panthers, and about the lusty life of boating and rafting on the river. Here, too, some came to learn the latest news from passing travelers as well as to discuss the leading questions of the day. One item of discussion that aroused considerable interest for some time was about the activities of the George Lemon family. Some of the habitues of the rest well remembered the day George first arrived on the Little Kanawha. Somewhat to their surprise was his announcement that he had come up from Lower Virginia to develop a commercial salt works in the vicinity. Although the Great Kanawha River Valley was widely known for its salt deposits, the only salt brine location of any significance along the Little Kanawha was at Bulltown, 100 miles upriver. So it was with more than usual interest that the people there followed the activities of the Lemons. Soon after George had chosen a house site for his family at the forks of the Hughes River, a tributary of the Little Kanawha, he became aware of the presence of oil floating on the water that flowed past his residence. Visualizing the possibilities of a profitable part-time sideline to the salt business he hoped to establish, George at once began to make plans to trap the oil. Since it was in the fall of the year, when the river was at low stage, he put his sons to the task of digging pits in the sand of the river channel. As the oil seeped into these pits, it was collected and stored in barrels to await shipment to market. One day, the people at the rest saw a log raft coming down the Little Kanawha, the first of many such rafts of its kind that were to follow in subsequent years. On this raft was George Lemon and one of his sons with a cargo of oil. At the junction of the Little Kanawha with the Ohio, the barrels of oil were transferred from the raft to a steamboat, while the raft was sold to the proprietors of a local sawmill. From that point, the steamboat transported the oil upriver to Marietta, where it was sold to the firm of Bosworth, Wells and Company for 33 cents a gallon. This firm, in turn, sold the oil to drug and chemical companies in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Cincinnati, New York, and St. Louis under the label of Seneca Oil. It was regarded as having rare medicinal properties for the treatment of ailments of both man and beast. One of the more common uses of the oil was its application to harness worn sores on draft animals. When George and his sons eventually got back to their initial interest and sank a well in quest of a salt brine, they only found more oil. This new discovery drew considerable attention to the area. One person who was especially interested was Bushrod Creel. He successfully claimed ownership of this land and soon replaced the Lemons in the production of oil. Late one evening, two husky teenage boys arrived at the rest. They were Otho and Argyle Boston, twin sons of the widow Boston of Belpre. They had heard about the new oil business on the Hughes River and were hoping to find employment there. Before leaving home, the boys had spent many long hours trying to convince their mother that they were old enough to work away from home. Because the boy's father had lost his life in a steam boiler explosion on the Ohio, she did not want her sons to work on the river. After promising their mother they would not seek work on steamboats, the twins were granted permission to look for employment elsewhere. While at the tavern, the twins met Bushrod Creel, who agreed to hire them as apprentices. On the following morning, it was with considerable excitement they set out with their new employer for the oil works on the Hughes River. They were especially pleased over the fact they would not be separated in their employment. They could not remember ever being apart from each other, even for a day. After working there for some time in a variety of jobs, the brothers were then assigned to help operate a raft in the transportation of the oil downriver to Parkersburg. They talked this over between themselves and jointly concluded that working on a raft would not violate the promise they had made to their mother not to work on steamboats. They saw this too as an opportunity to visit with their mother more often. Early one morning, a raft laden with several barrels of oil was untied from its mooring at the Creel Oil Works. In charge of the craft were Abe Pack, an experienced riverman, and the Boston twins. As they drifted down the placid Hughes River, they had no way of knowing of the perils that awaited them. At that time, the Little Kanawha River, above its junction with the Hughes, was rapidly nearing flood stage, even though there had been only a light rain in the Hughes River area. Some cloudbursts farther up the Little Kanawha had turned the normally clear and calm river into a turbid, whirling torrent. While still some distance from the junction of the two rivers, Abe at first detected a slowing down of the raft. Some distance farther down, he noticed that the river had come to a standstill. Shortly thereafter, the raft began to drift back upstream. Realizing there was something amiss on the Little Kanawha, he directed the twins to help him maneuver the raft closer to the riverbank, where they tied it to a nearby tree. There they waited until much of the flood water of the Little Kanawha had moved on. Then, believing it safe to venture out again, Abe and the twins guided the raft with its cargo of oil out into midstream and at once began moving slowly downriver. The backup water from the Little Kanawha had subsided and the hues appeared to be near normal again. On their entering the water of the Little Kanawha, they saw the banks of that stream still littered with debris left by the flood. The water was muddy and still above the normal stage of flow. They noticed, too, as they moved downstream, that uprooted trees and logs occasionally blocked portions of the channel, and only through skillful maneuvering of the raft were they able to avoid them. Abe's long experience on the river had taught him to keep a constant lookout for whirlpools, and with special precaution during and immediately after floods, just as the Indian name of the Great Kanawha meant River of Whirlpools, it could likewise have been applied to the Little Kanawha as well. Some 8 or 10 miles below the mouth of the Hughes River, the channel of the Little Kanawha became somewhat narrower. As they approached that location, Abe detected the presence of a whirlpool at the right side of the river. Believing there was ample space to pass through safely on the left, he instructed the twins to help him steer the raft in that direction. Near the surface of the water, on the left side, yet not visible to the occupants on the raft, was a huge log directly in their path. When the raft ran against the sunken log, the force of the collision threw Abe headlong into the smooth-flowing side of the river, while the raft, with the twins still on board, swung sharply sideways and directly into the path of the whirlpool. The twins, in their fright, could only cling together in sheer terror. Suddenly, the raft capsized and the twins disappeared into the swirling vortex of the whirlpool. After Abe had clambered up the south bank of the river to a place of safety, he looked back and saw only logs and barrels scattered over the river. The twins were nowhere to be seen. In all subsequent searches, the bodies of the twins were never found. After several weeks had passed, Miss Boston, accompanied by a close friend, rode up from Belpre by way of the newly constructed Staunton Turnpike to view the place where her sons had last been seen. While she and her friend stood there on the bank and looked down into the river, what appeared to be an arm rose up out of the water and waved them back from the danger spot. Then, as the mother looked down into the whirlpool's foamy vortex, she was sure she saw, for one fleeting moment, the pallid, terror-stricken faces of her sons. In the years that followed, even after a subsequent flood had washed the whirlpool out, rivermen stopping at the rest often reported they had heard strange noises as they passed the location of the mishap. Some believed the place was haunted. It seemed to be habitually visited by the restless spirits of the unfortunate twins. That's the end of the story, you guys. That's story number 8.